Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to the teachings of the Gospel of John. Today's teaching will be on chapter 19. And before we begin, though, let's review a little bit about the last chapter we looked at. In chapter 18, Jesus is arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. And here he uses another I am statement, very familiar to us throughout the Gospel of John. And this shows us his absolute authority over the situation. Peter misguidedly used violence to protect Jesus as he cuts off a servant's ear, but then he's corrected by Jesus. And then Jesus is willingly bound and taken away to be tried. The first part of his trial is before the high priests. During this time, Peter denies being a disciple or even knowing Jesus. And everything the high priest does and says is against Jewish law and tradition. It's really a mock trial. It has no legal authority. And then after the high priest, Jesus is brought to Pilate, the Roman governor of Israel, where Pilate questions him about his kingship. The Jews condemn Jesus and demand the release of a rebel instead. As we move into chapter 19, the scene continues with Pilate continuing to plead unsuccessfully for Jesus' life. During this time, the Jews continue to demand his crucifixion, and Pilate's cowardness and fear of the Jews is revealed as he succumbs to their desires. Then the Jews declare their allegiance to Rome. Jesus is then crucified. His clothes are divided up, and he provides for his mother care before he dies. Again, and Jesus dies and is buried. His last words are spoken during that time. His side is pierced, and his body is laid in a fresh tomb. So let's begin with that scene continuing with Pilate pleading for Jesus' life. Verses 1 through 3. So Pilate then took Jesus and had him flogged. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and placed it on his head, and put a purple cloak on him. And they repeatedly came up to him and said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and slapped him in the face again and again. The crown and the purple robe represent his royalty, which the soldiers mocked, purple being the symbol of royalty in the Old Testament. Typically done with a whip that had sharp pieces of bone or metal tied to the ends to tear the skin. So the thorns were probably 2 inches long and pushed into his scalp. The suffering was not necessary for our atonement, but the suffering fulfilled the prophecy from Isaiah 53:5, the second part, which says, "The punishment that brought us life and peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed." After that, Pilate brings Jesus back out to the crowd. And we see in verse 5, Jesus then came out, wearing a crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to him, "Behold, the man." This is interesting, the way he uses the word man. Pilate's wording here, the phrase "the man" in Greek, indicate that Jesus is not a single person, but is representative of all mankind. Pilate wants no part of Jesus' death and tells the Jews to crucify Jesus themselves. But the Jews respond in verse 7, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he made himself out to be the Son of God." This frightens Pilate even more, so he takes Jesus back inside to question him again. And to those questions, Jesus first refuses to answer. And then he tells Pilate that it's not by Pilate's authority that Jesus is before him, but God's. This is verses 10 and 11. Pilate says, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you realize I have the power to either free you or crucify you?" But Jesus answered, "You will have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who's handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." So Jesus doesn't excuse Pilate's actions, but places ultimate responsibility on others. Well, who are these others? Well, it doesn't say, but possibly Judas, who is his betrayer to the Jews. But it could be Caiaphas, the high priest, that condemns him. Or it could be the unbelieving Jews in general. Now, by the same token, every person is responsible for their own belief or unbelief. We crucified Jesus by not believing in him. Pilate then unsuccessfully pleads for Jesus' life again, and the scene ends with verse 15. So they shouted, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? Chief priests answered, we have no king except Caesar. Now, here I want to add a different ending to this scene, which we can see from Matthew 25, verses 24 and 25. This reads, now when Pilate saw that he was accomplishing nothing, but rather that a riot was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. You yourselves shall see. All the people replied, his blood shall be on us and on our children. They cursed the entire Jewish race with these words. And the curse has had its fulfillment throughout the next 2,000 years. The temple was destroyed 30 years later, and the Jews began to be persecuted as a people. And that persecution continues throughout the world, even to this day. We move on to the scene of the crucifixion. Verses 19 through 22. Now Pilate wrote an inscription and put it on the cross. It was written, Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews. When Jews read this inscription, because of the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, it was written not in English, but in Hebrew, Latin, and in Greek. So the chief priests of the Jews were saying to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews, rather write that he said, I am the King of the Jews. But here Pilate answers, what I have written, refusing to take down the sign and redo it. Now, it's interesting, in Latin, remember, 3 languages, Latin, Hebrew, and Greek. In Latin, the first letters of each word, Jesus, Nazarene, King, Jews, the letters are I-N-R-I. And we see these depicted above many crucifixes in the Western culture. But however, what Pilate had written in Hebrew is even more significant. In Hebrew, the first letter of each becomes Y-H-W-H. And this is the Hebrew name for God that he gave to Moses at the burning bush when he called Moses to deliver the Hebrews from Egypt. This is known as the Tetragrammaton. Those 4 letters together are not pronounceable without adding vowels between the consonants. And so when you add the vowels, it becomes Yahweh, Y-A-H-W-E-H. And what this does is it says to the Jews that Jesus is not only king, but God. No wonder the Jews were so upset with the writing. Now, John's accounts of the crucifixion includes a description of several prophetic fulfillment. The casting of lots, or the gambling for Jesus' garments. We see that one prophesied in Psalm 22, verse 8. The idea that no bones were broken. We see this in Psalm 34, verse 20. The piercing of his side is prophesied in Zechariah 12:20, and given sour wine, which we know as vinegar, to drink, in Psalm 69:21. So before Jesus dies, he completes his earthly obligations. Verses 26 through 27, when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, woman, behold your son. Then he said to the disciple, behold your mother. And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own household. Now, what is this significance? Well, as eldest son, it was Jesus' responsibility to care for his widowed mother. So before he passed on, he passes this responsibility to John, who willingly accepted it. Then verse 30, part A, recounts Jesus' last words. It is finished. Now, that's a very significant statement because it says Jesus is acknowledging that all the Old Testament prophecies of his life and his death had been fulfilled. And also, the judgment of sin was complete. The sinless man became sin for us. And the forgiveness of sin was accomplished by the shedding of his blood. So at the end of this verse, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Interesting that he gave up his spirit. What it says is he accepted death voluntarily. Then we go on to the end of the chapter, which describes the burial. Because of the upcoming Sabbath, the soldiers began to break the condemned men's legs, so they would be dead before sundown. But Jesus, being already dead, was pierced with a sword instead, fulfilling that pierced with a sword prophecy. Pilate released Jesus' body to Joseph of Arimathea, and Joseph and Nicodemus, which we saw in chapter 3 and chapter 7 of John's Gospel, wrapped the body and placed it in a tomb nearby. And that ends the chapter. So, as we just summarize this chapter, so Pilate continues to plead unsuccessfully for Jesus' life. The Jews continue to demand crucifixion. Pilate's cowardice and fear of the Jews is revealed as he decides to let the Jews have their way and crucify him. And the Jews declare their allegiance to Rome and also curse their descendants. Jesus is then crucified, his clothes are divided up, he provides for his mother's care, and gives up his spirit. Then, gives up his spirit, his last words are spoken, his side is crucified, and his body is laid in a fresh tomb. So this chapter ends with the worst day in history. But the best day of history comes again as we look at chapter 20. This is the next to the last chapter of John's Gospel. And in this chapter, we're going to see Mary Magdalene comes to the empty tomb and tells the disciples. Peter and John then also see the empty tomb. And Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene and tells her he's going to the Father. Jesus appears to the disciples as they're gathered together, everyone except Thomas. Jesus commissions the disciples and gives them the Holy Spirit. And then Thomas, after first disbelieving, believes when Jesus appears to them again. And John states his purpose in writing the gospel, as we can see at the end of this chapter. So until next time, God bless you all. It's been a great pleasure to show these things to you. Bye-bye.